Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 34th meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee in 2022. The first item on the agenda is consideration of whether to take items 4, 5 and 6 in private. Item 4 is the consideration of evidence we will hear today under agenda item 2. Item 4 is consideration of a draft letter to the Scottish Government. Item 6 is the consideration of a draft report on the legislative consent memorandum on the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. Are we all happy to take these items in private? We are agreed. We also have consideration of whether to take items in private at future meetings as listed on the agenda. These are the consideration of our approach to scrutiny on the outcomes of the UN Biodiversity Conference, COP15, and consideration of the committee's draft report on the role of local government, its cross-sectoral partners in financing and delivering a net zero. Are we all happy to take these items in private? We are. We'll then move on to agenda item 2. And before we move on to this, I would like to make a declaration of interest. Members will know that in my declaration of interest, I have declared that I have an interest in agricultural farming partnership and also in property rental markets. And I wanted to get that on the record because some of the subject areas we will cover today will include those. So our second item of agenda is an evidence session on the Climate Change Committee's recently published review of the Scottish emissions targets and progress report to the Scottish Parliament. On the 7th of December, the CCC laid in Parliament its 11th annual progress report as required by the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009. This report sets out 99 recommendations to the Scottish Government for meeting Scotland's emissions reduction targets for the years 2020, 2030 and 2045. I refer members to the relevant papers under agenda item 2. And I'd like to welcome our panellists from the Climate Change Committee who will join us remotely. First of all, the Right Honourable Lord Deben, the Chairman, Professor Keith Bell, the Scotland champion, Marilee, I'm going to get this wrong, is it Marilee? God, I'm fudging my words. Marilee Bufanu, analyst for the devolved administrations. I hope I got that right finally. And Emily Nurse, the team leader for carbon targets. Thank you all for accepting our invitation, and we're delighted to have you here. Before we begin, I'd like to ask Lord Deben to make an opening statement.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'm very sorry that I am not with you in person as I had intended to be. You will be pleased because I've got the filthiest of colds, which you would not like to have caught. And unfortunately, the train service in the east of England, which I come from, is quite difficult. Anyway, we are all here. Chris Stark is actually in bed, so he is not with us, and I apologise for that and for him. He too is sorry, and he's not all that far away because he's in Glasgow, which is where he comes from. Now, this report. I'm sorry that we had not been able to continue the congratulations which we have been able to do in the past to the Scottish Government and Scottish people for the work that they're doing for climate change. As you know, we have used Scotland as an example for the rest of the United Kingdom for some of the things that you have been doing. Unfortunately, when it came to this year for us to look at the achievement, the delivery, we had to say that in a wide range of things, the delivery had not been satisfactory. And that is very important because, of course, if it isn't, then that puts greater weight on what has to be done in succeeding years. And we are now committed as a United Kingdom and the individual countries to targets for 2030 and 2035, as well as 2050. And the Scottish Government has helpfully and usefully made it clear internationally that Scotland will want to lead in this. The problem that we have and it's not just in Scotland, frankly, it's throughout the United Kingdom, is that it is easier to make policy than actually to deliver. And I can say that after 16 years of being a minister, I have noticed that right the way through, and it doesn't much matter who's in charge, it's always more difficult to deliver. And so it is with sadness that we've had to say that there is a whole series of things that have to be improved if Scotland is to remain on course. Now, I want to make it clear that we are very keen on pointing out when Scotland can't do what it should do because of problems with the relationships with the United Kingdom as a whole. But in this case, we do have to say that the areas we have highlighted are areas where the Scottish Government has control, and that some of the areas of success or relative success are areas in which the United Kingdom as a whole has control. And so it's not, I think, possible to say, well, this is all a problem between us. Although I do have to say in advance that I think it's really important for the relationships on climate change between the devolved governments and the United Kingdom government to become much closer and much more iterative. Because in the end, we have to solve these problems, and so many of them can only be solved by joint action.
Thank you very much for that. And as convener, I'm going to get the first question. So the first question, and I'm not sure who'd like to answer it. I mean, I would say if you want to answer it, just raise your hand and I'll bring you in. Of course, the danger is if no one raises your hand, I will arbitrarily pick somebody, so which we don't want to get. But the first question is, could we have a couple of examples? Lord Deben, I don't know if you're saying something to me, but your microphone is off. So when you indicate you want to speak, I can bring you in. Sorry, did you want to say something there?
Well, I just wanted to say that if there's any difficulty about nobody answering, I'm prepared to order somebody to do so, if I may put it like that.
Well, of course, as an ex-soldier, I like the idea of ordering somebody to answer. It doesn't always work. But, OK, the first question is, could we please have a couple of examples of good news projects where the UK has worked together with Scotland to achieve a target, and a couple of examples, briefly, of areas where they have failed to work together, where they could have worked together and achieved more than has been achieved? I don't know who would like to head off with that one.
Well, Marilee or Emily, please. Emily?
Emily.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, Emily, you're off.
I'm sorry. I can't hear very well. I'm really sorry. My headphones weren't plugged in. Could you repeat the question?
Yes, I'm looking for a couple of examples of where targets have been achieved by the UK working together, i.e. Scotland and the United Kingdom as a whole, and a couple of areas where targets haven't been achieved because there hasn't been combined working.
I mean, so in terms of, I guess when we say targets, I suppose I'll talk more about sort of plans. So, for example, in the greenhouse gas removals, there's a plan. Scotland's plans were to have quite heavy reliance in greenhouse gas removals for the 2030 target. In fact, about 2/3 of the UK wide, and this was sort of assuming that that the Scottish cluster would be chosen for track 1 of the CCUS cluster sequencing programme, and of course, you know, they put in a bid and went on the reserve list, and this then has a knock-on effect for targets, the sort of hitting their targets, because there's a huge reliance on that. So this is an example where I think we haven't had good coordination. I also think that because Scotland is wanting to go a lot further in 2030 than the UK across all sectors, there is, for example, in buildings and transport, decarbonisation has to happen much, much faster than UK-wide. And I don't think there's been discussion there how that's going to happen when, for example, for rolling out heat pumps, the UK targets are slower than the Scottish ones, but the sort of Scottish policy is relying on the market-based approach to get that the UK government has to get that out without, at the moment, much extra policy on top of that. So there hasn't been sort of discussion there where how they're going to go above and beyond the UK rates. And similarly, in transport, electric vehicles need to be rolled out much faster in order to reach the incredibly challenging decarbonisation in that sector. And again, sort of the discussion of how that's going to happen hasn't happened so much. Keith, I think, wants to chip in as well.
Okay, I'm looking for a good example. Those seem to be both negative. Marilee, have you got a good example, or Lord Deben?
Well, I can kind of.
Okay, sorry, is that Keith? Is that you?
Yeah. Hi, good morning, everybody. Yeah, I mean, perhaps the biggest success story to date about emissions reduction, over the last 10, 20 years has been in the energy sector, and in particular in renewables and in the development of renewables. So the energy, of course, is a reserved power to Westminster, but the success of the development of renewables has depended not just on market mechanisms set up by the UK government, but also on the environment for investment created within Scotland. So, positive approaches towards planning, a general encouragement of investment, the development, the leadership shown by some of the companies that are based in Scotland. And of course, making use of the natural resources that we've got. So that is, I think, an enormous success story that is built upon efforts from many parties.
Lord Deben, did you want to come in? I saw your hand was raised.
Well, just to say that I think that what Emily said is really important in the sense that you were pressing for specific examples. Unfortunately, what is happening is that the generality of Scotland meeting its tougher targets, which were laid down by the Scottish Parliament, the generality of that has not resulted in a relationship with the United Kingdom government that has made that possible. And we are not suggesting that it is either side, but that this is just not happening. And it's not happening in the sense that if Scotland is to do better, which is what it's committed to, the United Kingdom government has got to make it possible for it to do better. And it has to do that in a number of ways, and those which Emily showed were the most important. But it is, as I said in my introductory words, it is the most important thing is that there is an iterative process, a constant iterative process, so that both sides can see how they can help the other to deliver what is both a separate and a single commitment. Separately, different targets, different ways of doing it, but united, because that's what we've said internationally the United Kingdom will deliver.
Okay, I think that's very helpful. I'm going to come to Mark Ruskell, who's got some questions now. Mark.
Thanks very much, and good morning to you all. Good to see you again. I wanted to ask you about how governments make decisions that are in line with net zero and in line with targets and lead to those delivery programmes that are needed on the ground. You'll be aware of the work of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government and the Fraser of Allender Institute in producing a report on budget reforms, and it focuses very much on the practice of how government makes decisions, as well as a critical net zero test. And the 3 steps that have been agreed within that were the introduction of a climate narrative into this year's budget, revision to the taxonomy next year's, and then the year after that, the full implementation of a net zero test across government. I wanted to get your views on that. Is that the right approach? Is there something missing in there? What's your analysis of the way that government is intending to make decisions going forward? Lord Deben,
Well, I think, first of all those things are extremely useful, Mr. Ruskell, because they all ensure that there is a common purpose running throughout the way in which the government is operating. I think the thing we notice most, looking at the whole of the United Kingdom, is that it is not just this disconnect between the joint actions of the countries. It's also the silos within countries, between ministries and between government and local government. And therefore, creating this kind of structure would seem to us to be valuable, but we would hope that it would be introduced in a way which was very sensitive to the fact that when you do one of these things, you don't just plonk an answer. You have to do it in a way which looks very carefully at how it's going to land and how people can buy into it. Some of the things that have been recommended are academically absolutely right, but you have to deal with people. And so we would very much advise this to have a degree of sensitivity, which I'm sure you will be able to do. It's one of the advantages of being rather smaller because of devolution, for you to be able to do that.
Are there any other reflections on the exact actions that the Scottish Government have agreed in relation to budget? I mean, what would you expect to see, for example, in the years ahead? I don't know if others would like to come in on this.
Well, Mary-Lee, yep. Yes.
Sorry, I think.
Hi.
Yeah, Mary-Lee, yeah, first, and then Keith.
Thank you. So I should start by clarifying that unfortunately, I haven't had the chance to review in detail the budget and the work by the Fraser of Allender. But from having spoken to them in the past, and after a kind of a series of visits that the committee carried out throughout the UK and in Scotland, one of the things that came out very strongly was a disconnect between the way that policy is designed, evaluated, and the budget, funding for such policy is allocated, and achieving those outcomes that are sort of aligned with tackling climate change. And the issue with that is that sometimes those outcomes are more long-term. They are designed to, they are meant to kind of span over a number of years. And that fundamentally, the way we kind of design policy in the UK and in Scotland is much more short-term than that. So one of the things that we identified in the Scotland Progress Report was the need for that, the considerations around how policy is designed and what sort of outcomes are decided to change, and for funding to follow that. So we heard a lot about the inability to deliver policy on a local level, for example, because the funding wasn't sufficient to allow for that, for kind of the necessary amount of time for the policy to be deemed successful, or it didn't necessarily, it wasn't supported by the long-term certainty required sometimes to allow for private funding to come in as well, or to allow for policy makers to design policy in longer term. So I would say that this is probably one of the biggest challenges, in addition to potentially a net zero test, which would allow the Scottish Government to centrally kind of identify those elements of policy that are aligned with, or that need to be aligned with, reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. So the committee has spoken about the net zero test in the past. I think we would support something like that. It's just a matter of doing it in a way that it doesn't only add to kind of the amount of bureaucratic work that needs to be done around policy design, and does deliver specific gains and targets specific projects in a way that that actually identifies the right outcomes and helps government move towards achieving them.
Thank you very much. Keith? Keith, did you want to come in?
Thanks very much. Yeah, absolutely. I would very much echo, the welcome of the three actions in principle. I think sound like the right things to do. Just to build upon what Marily was saying, I would say that a quantified analysis to back up the propositions is really important. There's something that we've observed in our progress report this year is missing from significant areas of policy from Scottish Government, and we were reassured by Mr. Matheson, for example, that the work is ongoing, and we will see some of that quantified analysis coming out soon. Another part of that, kind of related to that, is the monitoring of outcomes. So it's good. Of course, it's right. We have to set policy and to put some policies into action, but the outcomes then need to be monitored to see whether they're being effective in the way that's anticipated, and to adjust the policy if necessary. So another thing that we've observed in our progress report this year is there are a number of areas where actually the data aren't sufficient to be able to see whether action is progressing in the right direction. As Marily says, a lot of these things are kind of long term. So in the short term, you're looking for certain things to sort of be starting to ramp up. And if that's not happening, then the significant progress kind of, later in the decade or next decade is going to be very difficult to achieve. And there's all sorts of interdependencies, as we know, which is why a test across multiple departments is so important. But as Marily said, the private sector is extremely important in kind of building up supply chain skills and so on. That takes time to develop. So, we need to be able to have the data to see whether that really is being developed and have the opportunity to adjust policy if necessary.
Okay. I'm going to come to Monica. Lord Deegan, it might be helpful if we pose the questions and use your good military standing, as it were, to order the person to answer the question so we get the right person. I think maybe suggest who answers it rather than order it. Maybe that's a twist in my way of looking at it. Monica, your question.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. I hope you feel better soon, Lord Deegan, and best wishes to Chris as well. It's a shame he's not able to join the panel today. I listened to the webinar last week when your report was launched, so like many others, worried by what we heard, but today we want to focus on what can be done. What are the tools that we're not currently using that the Scottish Government and partners could be using. So my first question is to ask what specific policy options available to the Scottish Government do the committee feel are currently being underutilised or are poorly aligned with supporting the achievement of Scotland's decarbonisation targets? Lord Deegan.
Well, one general comment, and that is, you notice that in what Keith said, he referred to the lack of information in certain cases, lack of actual facts upon which to base decisions, and secondly, the need to use much shorter term measurements of outcomes. I mean, this is a practical thing that I think, Ms. Lennon, that you would agree, in one's ordinary life, it's very easy to say, for example, I'm going to lose weight over the next 5 years. But what you actually have to start off with is how you're going to lose weight over the next month, because otherwise it gets put off all the way. And the problem is, therefore, the measurement of outcomes and the replacement or the creation of the proper figuring that makes that possible are two things which really ought to be at the hands of the government and which need to be. But I think to go back there to Keith would be a good idea, because he will print some others.
Keith.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think the areas of policy that we highlighted particularly this year were in transport, buildings and agriculture and land. I think on the last of those, and maybe Emily will be able to come in and kind of put some more detail on this in a second, there is an opportunity following Scotland's exit from the EU Common Agricultural Policy, to set some new dimensions around agriculture policy. But it's not clear yet what's really happening there. There's opportunity that's definitely not being realised. And there is a relationship also with diet and the impact that our kind of dietary choices has on the use of land and emissions associated with agriculture. It's not a perfect link, because agriculture, of course, is used for exports as well as serving a local market, and there are imports that are used to kind of meet our dietary needs. And we're not talking about kind of radical changes, but changes nonetheless that kind of can have a positive impact both on health and on emissions. And the other part related to land is on peatland restoration, where the Scottish Government has set a target which isn't being met. Its target is less than the target that we recommended. On buildings, we've seen a commitment, I think, in the programme for government, something like £1.8 billion of investment over this Parliament, and I think it's something like £330 million promised for the coming financial year. So that's very welcome action. And as I mentioned before, it remains to be seen what the impact is of that, what the take-up is, and development of the supply chain to be able to deliver it. Positive actions in terms of information provision, and we wait to see how effective that is. The other big one, is transport that I just mentioned, where I think the target of reducing car kilometres by 20% is fantastic, but we're yet to see the means by which that is going to be achieved. I think those are the three kind of big areas that I would highlight.
Keith, sorry, just before we do, Keith, we're going to come back to those three areas in some detail in a minute. So I'll definitely bring Emily in, but rest assured those three areas are going to be part of further questioning, as you won't be surprised. No, Emily.
Okay, all right. Well, I was going to give a bit more detail in the areas, but I'll hold off. But I'll just perhaps make a more general comment, which is that in some cases, in quite a few cases, because the decarbonisation of the sector, and in particular buildings and transport, and then in greenhouse gas removals as well, is so much faster than our recommended pathway. And there are these very ambitious milestones, such as this 20% reduction in car kilometres, which it goes so much further than our most ambitious scenarios. We actually haven't got the policy we haven't got a policy package that would make those work, because all of those, in order to make those work, you need to make sure that everything's considered, like the supply chain build up, the skills build up, and all of these things, scrappage of old technologies, etc. And so in some cases, it's not that we sort of have a set of policies that we can necessarily suggest, because we think these are very, very, very challenging targets to meet, and they go beyond what we had. And I think I'll leave the detailed examples I had then until we go into those sectors.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And conveners explained we're going to come into the subject areas. Lord Deeban.
To make this point even more strongly, the Scottish Government has been congratulated as the Parliament for committing itself to tougher targets even than those that we proposed. But the problems about that is that unless there is a clear movement towards those targets, they are not with meaning, because all you've got is a target and you haven't got any proof, so to speak, that you're moving towards it. Our problem is that because the target is further than that which we proposed, it's quite difficult for us to comment on how far you've moved towards it if there really is no programme to reach those targets. So there is here a kind of hiatus which really needs to be filled. There needs to be a very clear programme, step by step, of how Scotland is going to achieve targets which it has supported, it has put forward, and which are stretching beyond, indeed, what we would have proposed.
And I think today we want to explore how we can get away from what I think has been described as magical thinking to get meaningful targets that people believe can be achieved. So, conveners explained, we're going to come back to transport and buildings and land and agriculture. Mark Ruskell asked about the budget. I just want to ask what more could be done to support emission reduction goals, thinking about options around non-domestic rates, land and buildings, transaction tax and council tax. And you may be aware of some reports that have been published in recent months in Scotland, including the STUC report on options for increasing taxes in Scotland to fund investment in public services. That includes proposals around frequent flyer levy and carbon emissions tax, supported also by John Muir Trust. We've got the Stop Climate Chaos Scotland report, Financing Climate Justice, and a Vision for Scotland's Railways published last year that talks about a wealth tax to fund public-owned public transport and green bonds that could be issued by the Scottish Government and local authorities. Again, I wonder if the panel has any views on the role that those reports and recommendations could play in helping to achieve what we want to achieve in Scotland.
The role of the Climate Change Committee to lay down how governments reach the ends which they have set. Our job is to set the targets, and then if you want to do more than the targets, then we have to discuss with you how you're going to be able to do that, and there will be a wide range of things. There are some things which we do think to be so individually important that we can say that. So, for example, peatland restoration is a vital part of this. And the fact that Scotland is not achieving what it ought to be achieving when it does actually have a significant problem in that area is an example of where we could say that. I don't think it is up to us to say you raise money by a wealth tax, or that you encourage things by using the local government taxes and the rest of it. That is really for the government to make those decisions, because that's the elected government's role. Our job is to say that if you don't make any of those decisions, then the targets become fantasy rather than reality. And so what we're trying to do is to say, please make the decisions, the sort of political decisions which you need to make, so that we can see a real route to the ends which you have committed yourself to. And we, in addition to that, we do have to say that there are some areas which you really do have to look at. For example, we believe that we ought to be eating less meat but better meat. Now that should be very good for Scotland, because you produce some of the best meat in the world, and we would much prefer people to eat rather less of it. Well, not of it, but of meat, but eat the good meat that comes from Scotland. That ought to be something which Scotland could really major on. But at the moment, there's no sign of that being part of the programme. And unfortunately, it's that sort of thing that we look for, a practical statement that that is what we're going to do, and here is the way to do it, and a real association with local government and farmers and the landowners and others to make that a reality.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Jackie now, Jackie Dunbar, with your questions.
Okay, thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Thank you for coming along. In Scotland, we need to move quickly to achieve our ambitious targets, but this could present a potential conflict with our commitment to a just transition. So how do we ensure that the just aspect of the transition remains our top priority? And I'll leave it in your hands as to who's best to answer.
Well, I think I ought to start by saying you are quite right that the just transition is a crucial part. I don't think that you can divorce fairness, if I may use that word, from climate change transition, because you can't do that for two reasons. One is it doesn't work if you don't make it fair, and secondly, people won't have it if you don't make it fair. So I don't believe that this is a conflict. I believe it's part of the same thing, which is why one has had to say to the United Kingdom government, for example, that fighting climate change is means that you have to do the very things you've got to do to deal with the cost of living crisis, which of course is one of the areas in which unfairness is most obvious. So I don't believe that there is a conflict between the two, and I believe you have to bring those two things together. And that's part of the role, it seems to me, of the democratic government, and it's also part of the role of the government working with local authorities. One of our issues is that we don't believe that in Scotland there is a sufficiently good partnership between government and local government to achieve a lot of these things. And many of the things that we have to do, if you think, for example, about the insulation of houses, about making life easier for those in fuel poverty, those cannot be done centrally. They have to be done locally by the local authority that knows about the area and can make those decisions for that section of the community. So it's getting a much better relationship there as partnership seems to us to be very important. All I can say to you is I wouldn't be too upset in Scotland because it's true about the rest of the United Kingdom, except for Wales, which does seem to have achieved this extremely well. But perhaps, Emily, you'd like to make any points about the congruence of justice and delivery.
I think Marily's going to come in on this one.
Is she?
Yes.
Yes,
Thank you. So just to add to what Lord Deben has just said, considering just transition in the decarbonisation course is a statutory commitment in Scotland. It's part of the Scottish Climate Change Act. And from a central government perspective, I know the Scottish Government has committed to providing sectoral plans for the decarbonisation of each economic sector that are also meant to be incorporating just transition considerations in them. And that will be starting with with an energy strategy that will also include a just transition plan for the energy sector, mainly considering the transition of skills and the transition of the workforce as required, but hopefully including certain aspects in there around aspects of fairness, social fairness, and what decarbonisation might mean for this sector. But just transition is a big question, poses a big question on skills and on transitioning the workforce. And this is really where kind of the emphasis needs to be, because the skills and having the right the right workforce in place to deliver the decarbonisation of each sector is also one of the big hurdles to achieving the kind of just going beyond the pathway that Scotland has been following so far in order to deliver those very, very stretching targets. But hopefully we'll start to see some of the just transition considerations being incorporated in policy from going forward. Also as a result of the Just Transition Commission, which is now, I believe, reinstated and is meant to be advising the Scottish Government exactly on this, how they can incorporate just transition aspects in the decarbonisation plans. But yes, some very big questions there. It's going to be difficult, particularly because Scotland needs to go faster, and it's a matter of just making sure that when policy is designed, it's designed well from the beginning. And these questions around fairness, around transitioning the workforce, are incorporated from the very beginning.
Thank you. I'm going to come on to the next section, which the Deputy Convener Fiona Hislop is going to start off with on buildings. Fiona.
Good morning all, and I want to focus some questions on buildings. Why was it considered too early to say whether the government was on track with its low carbon heat ambitions, and what evidence would you need as a committee to adequately assess progress? So Lord Deben, if you could indicate who you'd like to answer that question, please.
Well, I think Emily should answer that question and then perhaps come back to Keith and me. Emily, start, please.
Okay, yeah, I'm unmuted. Yeah, so it was too early to say because of this. Well, a couple of reasons. So one is that we just don't have the data. This is something Keith raised earlier. So particularly in the building sector, this is an issue. We don't have the data that we can use to monitor how fast heat pump rollout is going, how quickly energy efficiency installations are happening. So this makes it quite difficult to make a call. But the other thing is that this is something where, you know, things need to happen really fast, but they're just getting started in terms of heat pump installation, and we recognise that. And so what we need to see is this happening really fast in the next few years. We need the data to assess that. And in terms of the judgment on the policy being good enough, we don't have the detail in there. Again, this is the issue of having to go faster than UK-wide and faster than our recommendations, much, much faster in this sector. This sector, the Scottish Government the update to the climate change plan sees a 70% reduction in buildings emissions compared to 2020 levels by 2030, so in 10 years, which is, and in our pathway, that was much, much less than that, about 35%, so about half that. So the rate that that heat pumps need to come out is sort of double what we recommended in our pathway, and that's a stretching pathway. That's our most ambitious scenario. So what we don't see is a sufficient policy to sort of show that that it can go above and beyond. And the reason it's too early to say, as I said, is because we don't have the data to see how it's actually happening on the ground.
Keith, I think you were going to come in next.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of add to what Emily has been saying, you know, I mean, for example, there was a policy announced a couple of weeks ago for a grant of £7,500 for a heat pump installation, and the budget available for that, I think, was something like £45 million over the coming year. So that supports about 5,500 heat pumps, which is good, but it only scratches the surface, really, of what the ambition says should be achieved. You know, the kind of annual installation rate ramping up to sort of tens of thousands per year by the mid-2020s. I think another thing, we're building on something that we talked about a bit earlier, where, you know, I think Ms Lennon was talking about various reports and giving different policy recommendations. A lot of those talked about raising public funds. And of course, public investment is a really important part of all of this, but so is private investment. And the kind of, the environment set for private investment is a really important part of policy. And part of that environment, a really important one, is regulation. So, for example, setting standards on energy efficiency in buildings and in homes in particular. And there seems to be a bit of a gap there. And in addition to that, not just setting the standard, but monitoring that the standards are adhered to. So that does, the monitoring does cost some public money, but a lot of the achievement of standards, certainly in the private ownership sector, is going to be achieved by private investment. So the policies to achieve that, or the point of a kind of the life of a building, maybe when it's changing hands, for example, to try to enforce something is a really important part of it. And as Emily said, the ambition set by the Scottish Government to deliver the 2030 emission reduction target is extremely challenging. So we really need to see things getting going very soon.
Okay, Lord Deben.
Point. We have to see things getting going very soon indeed. And I just want to emphasise the suggestion that one of the areas which would be very important would be that when buildings change hands, that should be the moment in which one has the opportunity to improve the standards of the building. But it's also true that Scotland hasn't made more quickly than the rest of the United Kingdom the standards which new buildings should be built at. We've been pressing that for the United Kingdom as a whole. I'm sorry that Scotland hasn't taken a unilateral position there and demanded higher standards for new building, particularly new domestic building. And it seems to me also that the point about enforcement is crucially important. We don't have any real evidence that in Scotland what regulations you do have are being adequately enforced. And if we have greater regulations, which is what we think is necessary, then regulation without proper enforcement is meaningless in the end. What you need is proper enforcement. And that again comes back to a relationship between central and local government. And you need all that because the private sector demands it too, because if they're going to invest as we want them to invest, they want to invest in circumstances where they have certainty and where in fact in competitive terms they don't find themselves doing the right thing and then being undercut by someone else who's not doing the right thing because the enforcement or the regulations are not satisfactory. So it is a question of bringing all that together. And that's always true, but it's particularly true if you have high standards.
It might be helpful to share with you that only in the last few days it looks as if the Scottish Government has indicated that it will be bringing forward those standards that you talked about for new build. But I'll leave that one there. The other question I wanted to ask is, if the Scottish Government does not have powers to restrict the sale of replacement fossil fuel boilers, can it realistically expect to move faster than the rest of the UK on low carbon heat? Although I understand very recently the UK Government has got a consultation out on replacement fossil fuel boilers that they would need to be hydrogen compatible after a certain date. Is that the sort of thing that we're absolutely reliant on the UK Government doing because they have the powers in that area? Lord Deeman, who would you like to answer that question?
Well, let me just say, I'm entirely on your side when it comes to making sure that the partnership works properly. And here is an area where the partnership has to work properly. And I think that the United Kingdom government has been slow at dealing with the replacement boiler area and improving the situation that they had. So I'm not blaming the Scots. I'm merely saying that altogether we haven't done this effectively. But Keith has looked at this rather carefully from the point of view of the of energy. So Keith.
We'll go to Keith and then we'll go to Emily because I think she had her hand up as well. So Keith first and then Emily.
All right. We'll go to her first then. I can't see the hand.
Okay, we'll go to Emily and I'll chip in. Yeah, she had her hand up.
Right.
Go for it.
Emily.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And it's another one of these things where obviously because of the 2030 target, things do need to go faster in Scotland than UK-wide. And so restricting the sale of gas boilers is UK-wide. So what I guess, and this is, again, this is a real challenge. We don't have a suggestion for policy package out there to do that. But what I guess the focus needs to be is to really encourage take-up. You can still do that even if the restriction to the sale has a different date. But you need to make have other ways and policies in there to encourage take-up of low carbon heat. And that needs to start happening now, basically. So yeah, Keith, if you want to chip in.
Keith.
I think that's a really important point about the market for boilers, for the appliances. It's going to be a GB-wide market, a UK-wide market to a certain extent. So the regulations that are set on that, analogous to, for example, a ban on the sale of new combustion engine vehicles, that has, if there's commitment to that, and the market has confidence that is going to be a firm policy that will be delivered on, the market will respond to that signal and will start making the alternatives available. For vehicles, it's very much a global market. It's slightly trickier in respect of heating appliances because, within Europe, I think it's us and the Dutch that make the most use of gas boilers. But on the positive side, there is already across Europe a market for heat pumps, albeit many of them are air to air rather than air to water, which a lot of our buildings would require. So yes, there is a UK-wide dimension to it, but there's also a Scotland dimension to it, because as well as having the appliances buy, or new types of appliances, when we can discuss whether being hydrogen ready is a good thing or a bad thing, and what hydrogen readiness really means. But you have to have the alternative available, which when we've talked about heat pumps, and we recommend them in view of the low carbon supply of energy to heat pumps via electricity and the coefficient of performance. The efficiency you get, 3 times the amount of heat, more or less, out of a heat pump comparison with the energy that you put in. So you have to have the opportunity to buy that. That is a kind of GB-wide market, but it also depends on local fitters who know what they're doing, who can install, look at the building, understand what's needed, what sort of specification you need, whether the radiators and so on are kind of fit for purpose, enhancements of insulation and so on. So that's a kind of marketplace that is much more local, and where, for example, in terms of education and skills, training provision in further education colleges, Scottish Government and local authorities here can have a big impact.
Convener.
Okay, perfect. We'll go to Jackie Dunbar. Jackie.
Thank you, Convener. What aspects of buildings decarbonisation can the Scottish Government deliver on its own, and which ones do you think would be more effectively delivered by jointly working with the rest of the UK?
Well, the first point about it is really to come back to Keith's point about the market. The reason for a UK policy is very often pressed by the fact that the market is a UK market, and if you want boilers, for example, to be as you want them, they're going to do that for the whole of the UK, and it's much better if you do it together on that front. But there are other things which specifically the Scottish Government can do, and that's largely in the area of regulation and standards, which it can do for its own areas perfectly properly. And one of the areas I've been pressing for, I suppose, almost 10 years now, is that one of the advantages of devolution ought to be that countries say, well, frankly, we're going to move faster than the United Kingdom on the subjects of, for example, the standards of people's new homes. I mean, in the United Kingdom as a whole, we've built 1.5 million homes unfit for the future because we changed the regulations. The government at the time, Conservative government at the time, in 2017, changed the commitment to net zero homes. And that's 1.5 million homes which have got to be retrofitted. Now, I just don't want that to go on. We're still waiting for the United Kingdom to get its future standards. There's no reason why Scotland couldn't have its own future standards, because the building is done locally and can be done and met those standards as long as they're enforced. Because one of the worries I have is that the present standards are very often not effectively enforced. And that's why the relationship between government, the Scottish Government and local government is so important. That's the area that I would concentrate on in things that Scotland could do for itself without the rest of the United Kingdom. But do you have things, Keith, that you'd like to add to that, or Emily?
Yeah, I might just say that another dimension to this, I mean, heat pumps in individual buildings is not the only option for decarbonisation of heat. You can also have heat sources at scale, larger heat sources where access to heat is via heat networks, in other words, district heating. So that, again, is very much a local planning thing, closely involving local authorities, but also other parties. It works best within cities where you've got that sort of density of heat demand. You haven't got to have long heat networks. You can go very few kind of meters and reach a lot of energy users. So yeah, that's very much a local thing. There are complications. I mean, we've heard this discussed many times about quite how that gets going. The public sector does have an important part to play in that, though, I think, in terms of providing an anchor load, to say, well, here's a guarantee of a large user of heat, enough to kind of get the financial commitment to the heat network over the line. And then once it's committed to, it's being built, then it becomes easier to kind of get others involved. So again, that's something that can be done within Scotland and within particularly cities in Scotland.
Keith, you very neatly moved on to a question I think that wants to be asked next from Mark. So I'm going to go to Mark to ask that question, and then I've got a supplement from Liam, and I'd quickly like to ask a question after that. So, Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, the question I was going to ask was about local heat and energy efficiency strategies, whether that's the right approach. And I was listening to your earlier response, Keith, in relation to the conversion, the retrofitting, the numbers that we can get through the current system. Do you think that LHES could provide a real step change? So a move maybe towards more area-based schemes where we're looking at whole communities or streets that are being retrofitted and invested in. Does that provide the right incentive for private sector investment? It just feels that we're struggling to find the real step change here. And I know there's some work happening with LHES at the moment, but does that fill you with hope, or is there still some way to go?
A bit of both. I mean, hope in the sense that I think the outline of the approach is right. To look locally at what's the right solution for a particular place. Access to different heat sources, the way of moving that energy around, and so on. But at the same time, I think you're right that there's a long way to go. It's a challenge to turn an outline of a strategy into delivery, and that's something we're coming back to again and again in this session. The kind of commercial and regulatory environment doesn't make it easy, and I'm not quite sure what's the best approach to kind of doing something about that. So, for example, a local authority can outline what it believes, having commissioned some analysis. And again, we've talked about different local authorities have different capacity to do this. Some are kind of doing it very well, engaging with it quite strongly. Others find it difficult because of the resources that they've got, the kind of lack of expertise locally. So, okay, that's a whole other dimension to it. Let's assume they have got a strategy. How is that implemented? It does depend on a lot of private investment, whether at the scale of a heat network or, as you say, it stands to reason that there could be efficiencies, cost efficiencies, by going sort of street by street. But what are the mechanisms by which a contract can be let on that? How does that interact with the kinds of energy supply contracts individual householders have, with the kind of their gas and electricity supply? Some of those suppliers in the market are now offering some of these services themselves. Thank goodness there's finally some innovation coming in that, and I look forward to seeing how that plays out. But that maybe works against a kind of a street by street approach, arguably, And there is a dimension of choice which I think often gets overlooked. The UK Parliament, various of the committees down there, set up some climate assemblies. When was it? It was, I think they were kind of finishing off their work at the start of the pandemic. So I guess the first half of 2020. And that was a big message that came out, I think, that struck me quite strongly, was, the members of the Assembly, as you know, drawn from all sectors of society, were persuaded of the kind of the rightness of the energy transition and of reducing emissions kind of more generally, in spite of the cost, and certainly the short-term cost in terms of the capital assets. But they said, we do want a choice on it. We want to be able to kind of, make a decision for ourselves about exactly what solution is used. So there is a tension there, arguably, between what an individual householder might want, what is the most kind of cost-effective solution for an area, and the delivery of it. And so, I'm sorry, that's not sounding very positive, because it doesn't sort of suggest any answers. Although the positive bit is there is a willingness to kind of engage with it. It points back, I think, possibly to the kind of the secret sauce here would be back to the local authority. The local authority and having a democratic mandate locally, where people have expressed their choice through their votes. So if that can be all kind of, if the local authority proposition about how to deal with heat decarbonisation is very clearly communicated to voters in the local area, then arguably it gets some kind of legitimacy when they come to implement that policy.
That's the local level. Can I ask you, why is the CCC so resistant to boiler scrappage schemes and scrappage schemes in general? Because this is a really challenging report on government, but I'm just wondering why there are some policy options that seem to be off the table. I think you mentioned this earlier on, Emily, in terms of some scepticism about scrappage or.
Well,
Emily.
well, I think what I said, yeah, what I said was that it needs to be considered when you're considering going much faster, say with boilers, which means that you then have to scrap boilers. You have to, of course, consider the embodied emissions and take that into account and make sure that it's practical. It's not that we would rule it out at all, but it just needs to be part of the plan, and it needs to be acknowledged how much scrappage there has to be, and whether, considering the embodied emissions in that, whether that's something that we want to happen. So it's more that we need to understand, given the fast rate of rollout of new technologies, what that means in terms of scrappage.
Okay. Right.
Liam, I think you had a supplementary question.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Lord Deben, you note in your report that it is currently, this is a quote, it is currently very difficult to monitor progress against the necessary measures for decarbonising the building sector due to a lack of adequate and up-to-date data. Would you have expected data collection mechanisms to be in place already? And in your experience, which such mechanisms could and perhaps should be introduced to monitor and support delivery?
Well, I'm never one for expectation in the first place, if I may say so, Mr. Kerr, but let me try to turn it round in this way. If you are going to have high expectations and tough targets, you really do have to start by knowing that you can tell how you're reaching it. I mean, it seems to me that the precursor, and the thing that has worried me about the Scottish tough targets is that nobody seems to have understood that you can't get there unless you can measure how you get there. And so, yes, we would have expected them, if not to be existent, to have been introduced. And the sort of measurements, I mean, even the very simple measurements in terms of updating the measurements for energy measuring of energy use, measuring of buildings. There are great faults in what we have at the moment. That was one area we might have expected. We might have expected a much tougher view about new buildings, both new measures in terms of regulation, but also new measures in terms of measuring those. In other words, there are a series of things you might have expected which were inevitably necessary if you have high standards. And those standards were fixed by the Scottish Parliament and government. And it does seem to us that they lacked the ability to measure. And if you can't measure, you don't do. And certainly, not only don't you do it, but you don't know whether you have done it or whether you have failed to do it. All we can say is there is no evidence that it has been done or is being done.
Yeah, thank you, Lord Deben. I'm very grateful. One further question on the heat and buildings strategy. We heard earlier that 1.8 billion is being put towards this over, I think, 5 years by the Scottish Government. We also know that the cost of achieving the heat and buildings strategy is apparently 33 billion, and that figure is now obviously dated. I asked a parliamentary question as to what that figure actually is now with inflation and things, and answer came there none. In your view, Lord Deben, is 1.8 billion sufficient? And do you get any sense of whether there is a concrete plan in place which will leverage £33 billion plus from that 1.8 billion contribution?
Well, in a sense, you've answered the question yourself, because there are two ways in which you can deliver, or a mixture of the two. The one is that the government pays for it, one thing. The other is that the government creates a system whereby the very significant sums available in the private sector are drawn into doing this. Our concern here is that it is pretty difficult to see a programme on either front. I mean, clearly this is not a sum which is sufficient of itself to deliver. On the other hand, we don't see the detailed mechanism whereby the government says, if we do it in this way, this will draw in these sums to achieve this end elsewhere. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for, well, frankly, we're looking for what you would expect in a business. If a business said to its shareholders, we are going to do X, Y, and Z, the shareholders would perfectly properly say, we want to see the programme, Mr. Chairman, as to how you're going to do that. And it's that we're asking for.
Very grateful. Convener.
Thank you, Liam. And just before we leave this subject, I'm tried hard to restrain myself and I couldn't, but I want to talk briefly about EPCs. When EPCs were brought in, I don't think there was anyone who thought they were a good idea and a really good measure of efficiency, energy efficiency. In fact, you could almost replace the lights in a property with LED lights and get a higher rating as a result of that than putting in double glazed windows. Do we think EPCs are the way forward, or do we think that we need to come up with a cleverer plan rather than just say, for example, if you don't meet EPC C, the house isn't fit for occupancy? So I don't know who would like to answer that question. You could just satisfy me by saying they're not great and we need a better system, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. I don't know, Lord Deeban, who you want to...
Well, I will say that. They are not great and we need a better system. I think life is about using what you've got to start with and then seeing that if it's not right, you change it. And I'm one of those who think that's exactly what we should be doing about EPCs. Given that our biggest problem is that we don't have measurements, to throw out what measurements you do have, even if they're not competent ones, is not perhaps the best way forward. But what you need to do is to change them and bring them up to date. And that is something which the Scottish Government could do and set an example for the rest of the United Kingdom. You see, what I want you to do is to give me opportunities of being able to say to the United Kingdom Government, for goodness sake, if Scotland can do it, why can't you? And that's a really important and valuable thing that you could do for us.
I can't help when I'm on a roll. Keith, you nodded. So do you want to agree with me? And I'll leave it at that, or if there's something else you want to add.
Yes, I'll agree. That's yep, definitely. They're not good. They never have been good. But I think, as Lord Deeban says, they're what we've got. So it's better to have something to drive things in the kind of positive direction than nothing. But absolutely, work to kind of replace them with something better is overdue.
Yep. Thank you. And I think I'll leave it there and go on to the next question, which is going to come from Monica. Monica.
Thank you, Convener. Wanted to pick up on transport, and you'll be aware that pre-pandemic in Scotland our annual car kilometres were increasing. We know we've got the 20% car demand reduction target. But the committee, you're very clear that there needs to be a paradigm shift if we're going to achieve that. And a note in your report in terms of recommendations, you link this target with Scottish Government documents on the National Planning Framework, for example, and the Strategic Transport Project review. So clearly looking for more alignment with other strategies and programmes. Would like to hear from the committee what policies you think the Scottish Government needs to use to support alternatives to the car use or to discourage car use, because we've still got a long way to go to get that modal shift to sustainable public transport and active travel. I know you don't want to give recommendations to the Government in terms of policy, but it feels like we are lacking in courage at the moment in the Government and in Parliament to make some of these tough decisions, because it's not all going to be popular. So if you maybe can give us a bit of a steer on some of the carrots and sticks that could be looked at, that would be helpful.
Well, Keith will not like me for saying that he's going to answer this, but I just want to make a single example, which I think is worthwhile. The problem with transport, Ms. Lennon, is this. As you well know, is that the moment you try to touch any of it, there's always a group of people for whom that is particularly damaging or difficult. So I don't blame the government for being reticent in trying to get this right because it is extremely difficult. But given that the Scottish Government has been very strong in its policies, in the sense of its aims, it really does have to grab this. And there is a series of things that could be done, but I shall go over to Heath to put forward those things. But I just don't want anyone to misunderstand that we're not saying this is an easy area. It's a very difficult area, but it is a crucial area. We have to do it. Climate change won't wait while we find some answer which is miraculous. Heath.
Yeah, I mean, I think you used some very key words in your question there, courage, and I think you're right. It's both Scottish Government and Parliament in terms of resolving some of those tensions that Lord Deben alluded to, where different interest groups will kind of oppose different, particular policies that you try to implement. The ambition, as we've said before, is great. The reduction of car kilometres by 20%. Previous Scottish Government reports have talked about a 20-minute neighbourhood, which I think is a fantastic idea. But waiting to see how that's going to be achieved. And I think you're right as well in your question that it has to be a mixture of carrots and sticks. The carrots, it's encouraging people onto public transport. The modal shift that you mentioned again is absolutely key. There are some things that do sound really positive in that respect. For example, the free bus travel to people aged 21 and under. Hopefully that will kind of not just encourage young people to be using the buses, but to get into the habit of using buses where they'll continue to do so. But that depends on the bus service being really good and being reliable and frequent. And there's great variation in the quality of bus services across, not just particularly rural areas, but also in cities. I live in Glasgow. I try to use the bus from time to time, but it's a bit of a lottery about whether the bus will actually turn up. There are signs on the bus stop that you imagine would be telling you where the bus is and how long it's actually going to take, but it turns out all it's doing is repeating the timetable, or so it seems, rather than having the active monitoring. If you've got an app on your phone, I'm told maybe that works. But things like this that are perfectly achievable. Other cities manage to do it. Why can't we manage to do it in Glasgow? So we've got to build up confidence in the public transport system.
Thank you. Can I just stick with buses? Can I just stick with buses right now, because you're making me think about our local situation in Hamilton, where the express bus service that was really popular with students, for example, from Hamilton right into the centre of Glasgow for university and college and so on, that bus was taken away during the pandemic and we don't have it back yet. So other colleagues in the chamber in debates on these topics have talked about public transport deserts in their local communities, and in rural areas it can be really, really challenging. So it's really great to have more people having access to free bus passes, but again, if they don't have the service, it's pretty useless. So in terms of this 20% target to reduce car kilometres by the end of this decade, do we need to see more action in that space around bus services and I suppose integrated public transport that actually works in terms of people's real lives and timetables, whether that's university, education, work, hospital appointments, socialising, shopping, whatever, because a lot of people say it's just so frustrating and so difficult to get around, and that's why they can't really give up their car or use a private car. So what more could be done around resourcing public transport? I know, again, the report from your committee talks about continuing the COVID-19 pandemic support for operators and local transport authorities. What's missing in that space, Professor Bell?
Well,
sorry.
No, Keith, go on.
Well, I mean, this is where it's getting a bit beyond the kind of into the detail that I'm not familiar with, but I think there is a question about the effectiveness of public policy and of the transport system. So yes, public support for it in terms of investing, providing support for buses that might not on their own be commercially viable, and getting some oases in some of those deserts, for example, is going to be a big part of it. But the coordination of public transport services, the ability to kind of use tickets across different means, again, other cities have managed it. I'm not quite sure why we don't manage it in parts of Scotland. I guess it's something to do with the contractual arrangements with the private service providers, in particular, the bus providers. I think it may well be kind of UK-wide legislation. You've heard the Mayor of Manchester talking a lot about this and about the ability for a local authority to take back control. Hey, where did we hear that phrase before? Of public transport, and it may well be that that's a kind of relevant thing in parts of Scotland as well. There has got to be a link across different areas of policy as well. Transport policy cannot be seen in isolation. It has to be seen in the context, yes, of course, of emission reduction, but also of spatial planning, of access to public services, the planning permission that is given for housing developments, to what extent are they linked in with access to amenities, shops, general practice, surgeries, dentists, and so on and so forth. So this has to all be brought together. It's not easy, but I don't know, does it depend on that word courage, again, at a local authority level, to insist on particular kind of services being provided, particular parts of development plans before they will be approved? To what extent does it depend on rules being set from Scottish Government level that then have to be implemented locally? I mean, that gets into the policy detail that I'm not familiar with. But that, it appears to me that there are levers that can be pulled, and in particular around that coordination of policy.
Okay, thank you, Monica. Jackie, I think you've got a couple of questions on this, or at least one.
Just the one, Convener, if you don't mind. It's about the low emission vehicles rather than public transport. Can I ask what can the Scottish Government do within the powers that it currently has to increase the market share of low emission vehicles in Scotland, whether that be electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles?
Lord Deeban.
Well, I think, Keith, you know about that, but may I just jog back a second? One of the things that we would like to emphasise is the importance of planning and the rules about planning if you're dealing with any of these things, and particularly on transport. The point that Keith said about transport and the need to have a planning system which actually does recognise that if you want to have the quarter of an hour living space, that you can get to things in a quarter of an hour, frankly, you can't do that unless you've got a planning system which makes sure that it happens. And that, again, is a hugely important part of what we would say.
Can I just say before we move on, you've just sort of almost played the magical tune to Monica, because that's one of her areas of expertise on planning. So thank you for doing that. And Keith, back to you.
Yes, Keith.
Yeah, I'm sure we're glad to be of service. So low emission vehicles, I mean, the good news is that they are starting to prove popular, especially electric vehicles. The sales figures, I think, over the last couple of years look very positive for them relative to combustion engine vehicles. It's still a challenge because they are very expensive. The upfront cost is high. A big part of the kind of uptake is, of course, about reputation, and word gets around. If you happen to know someone who's got one and they like it, they find it a pleasure to drive, then that's all great. Word, like I say, word gets around, and you get encouraged to go for it yourself. But there are negative kind of word that can get round as well about, and a particular one at the moment, I think, is about the reliability of charging infrastructure. So relative to other parts of the UK, I think in Scotland we don't do too badly for the number of public chargers or publicly accessible chargers, but we seem to have very mixed messages on quite how good they are. When you turn up, is it going to be in a working state? And then, have you got the right kind of means to pay for it? I think, again, it's probably slightly better in Scotland than other parts of the UK, but not consistently good. So that good reputation has to be spread, and any kind of bad reputation, we have to take action to address it. So I haven't had a chance to look into that. I mean, I think there was a BBC documentary recently looking at the kind of reliability of public chargers, and there seem to be some very different opinions from what the BBC investigation had revealed in comparison with data that came back from Transport Scotland. So yeah, I'm sure that's already on your agenda for digging into quite where those differences have come from.
Jackie, are you satisfied? Does anyone? I'm not. Emily, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah. I mean, Keith's already made some of the points I was going to make, but I guess I just want to make the point that in general, this is an area that is more positive than some others. In particular, with offering of Scottish Government offering grants for installing home chargers and interest-free loans that extend to second-hand vehicles. This is all very positive stuff. Again, and some of the concerns are to do with things like, making sure this comes out to the full consumer base, and so that's addressing price disparity with home and public charging points, etc., etc. But I guess I just wanted to make this point again that the sort of challenge here, despite good progress, is that things really just need to go faster than UK-wide. And actually, what we're seeing is that actually electric vehicle sales are actually slightly behind UK-wide. So again, it's just sort of trying to go faster and faster than our most stretching pathway again. So this is always the challenge, even though progress is generally quite good here.
Okay, Mark, I think you've got a supplementary on that.
Just to refocus on delivery programmes again, we just had the Strategic Transport Projects Review, the second one launched in Scotland. I'd be interested in your views on that. The next stage of that process is the prioritisation of a delivery plan. There's some big ideas in there, such as mass transit schemes in the cities. Are there things in STPR2 that you would question, or is it all in line with the 75% target and the 2040 target? I'm not sure who would like to take that.
Well, if we start with Lord Deben, and he can then allocate it to a...
Well, I think, first of all, in general, yes, we will go along with this. Without being too critical, I mean, the real trouble is, again, in the detail. As you well know, Mr. Ruskell, it's about the detail. So if we're not careful, what we've got is yet another layer of what needs to be done, another layer of generalities. But I still want all the time to be pushing down to the basis of what actually has to be done, who is going to do it, who is going to provide the resources for it, how it is actually going to work out on the ground, and above all, how you measure how successful it's been. And I don't think that last has played enough part in what has so far been put forward. But if I go to Keith.
Keith, briefly.
To add, actually, just to reinforce the same points. It's fantastic. Set out some bold ambitions and schemes, but the reality of kind of taking them forward also has to be addressed. The implementation dimension is a really critical part of it, setting out what that would look like, how it would be funded, and with kind of credible projections on what impact it would have.
Okay, thank you both for those comments. Can I move on to aviation? I mean, obviously the Scottish Government has some limited powers over aviation, but it does, or it will have some powers over passenger duty. It has powers over planning. How do you think that the government should be tackling aviation right now, particularly in the light of a forthcoming aviation strategy? Lord Deben.
Well, I'll go to Keith for general, but just to make the general point is that any aviation policy is bedevilled by the fact that immediately you say anything, and I say this in support of all governments, immediately you say anything, a great howl comes out that you're stopping people's holidays or you're stopping people doing the things that they want to do, whereas that's not what you need to do or should be doing. And obviously there are two things which are crucial. One is, how do you make sure that using an aeroplane is less necessary? And that really is something which isn't entirely in the hands of the Scottish Government. but it is something which they ought to be pressing the United Kingdom government for, is to recognise that people will use alternatives if there are alternatives, and what are those alternatives. I would hate to get into the subject of ferries, because that does seem to me to be probably not an area that would be a good place to be. But the fact is, there is in Scotland a very special need for aviation, but that shouldn't cover up the areas where you can actually replace aviation by other mechanisms. And again, it's a question of being accurate and precise and detailed about it. And then the second thing is that the conditions round the aviation is an area where you can make big differences. I'm talking about the land-based emissions around airports and such like, where you really can make a huge difference on the amount of emissions if you take that seriously, particularly as you are in an enclosed area where for example, fuel cell driven machinery and such like are available in that. So I do want people to think of aviation in the wider sense about the services providing and how you could reduce their impact, particularly in areas where you can't reduce in the present technological situation the actual need for the use of the aeroplane itself. But Keith.
Yeah, I think you've made pretty much all the points I would have made. I think that point about the land-based emissions at airports is a really good one. I mean, I think some work is going on. There's some colleagues at University of Strathclyde I know are involved in some work related to Glasgow Airport, for example. But the thing I would kind of re-emphasise is about the demand side. And so reducing the demand for aviation, it doesn't mean stopping people from going, 1 or 2 trips a year, short haul flights for holidays and so on. But the frequent flyers are kind of the obvious kind of places of interest here. And do they have to make so many flights, and can they make journeys by alternative means? So the alternative means have to be built up and given confidence in, which of course, as Lord Deeban says, links back to other forms of transport and. Let's say in respect of trips up and down to England, the rail system has to be up to scratch.
The French government's approach to banning certain domestic flights within 2.5 hours travel where there's a rail alternative. I mean, I think that was something that came out of the French Citizens' Assembly that the government has taken on and is now actually delivering. Different context, but.
That is absolutely true, but and I'm entirely in favour of that, but it does mean that you have to provide a proper alternative. And of course, the French have been better at providing the rail alternative than we have been over many years. This is we have to catch up with that if we're going to do that properly. And the other thing is that I don't think, as far as Scotland is concerned, that's it's going to make a huge difference, because you are talking very often about flights for which there really isn't an alternative. I mean, in the Climate Change Committee, we always use the train. We don't come up on the aeroplane to Scotland. We take that as part of the job that we have to do. Does mean the trains have to be running. That is, in fact, the role that we think we ought to play. And one of the issues that we haven't mentioned is that very many journeys can in fact be avoided by doing what we are doing now. Now, I would much prefer to be with you, because I haven't been able to be during this last year, and I wanted to make sure I was. But we all know in business that for every 4 meetings, there's no reason why 3 of them can't be remotely like this. Of course, you've got to get together from time to time, but I certainly find in my own businesses that we really have reduced our spending on air flights and such like simply by using this as a natural mechanism. And I think that those pressures should be added to by government advice and help. And it's an area there where we can reduce the need for flights. You can't reduce it if you want to go on holiday. You can't reduce it if you've got to keep an eye on a particular factory. But you can do 3 of the meetings with the factory without going there, and the 4th one you do go. It's that kind of choice, and the way in which we treat it and talk about it and behave, and it's the way government behaves too. The governments have got to be much better at using the extremely good video systems that we now have.
Thank you.
I'm just going to bring in briefly Emily, but can I just say I'm absolutely conscious of the time, and whilst I don't want to limit anyone's contributions, I just know that if I don't get all the committee members their questions, I'm not going to have a good Christmas. So, Emily, I'll let you come in, and then I'm going to go to Liam Kerr with the next lot of questions. So, Emily.
Okay, my challenge is to be brief. I just wanted to say that given the 2030 target, we sort of really have to do everything in every single sector. There's this big gap, and I think aviation demand and peatland restoration are in most cases, Scottish Government's ambition go further than us, and we worry about the delivery. They're the two examples where ambition is actually lower, and we really think that's needed in order to sort of, meet the target, given the big gap that we see. But I'll let you move on.
Thank you, Emily. Liam.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to turn to the area of agriculture and land use. The Climate Change Plan update aimed to reduce emissions from agriculture by around 28% between 2020 and 2030. Your committee, Lord Deben, says it's unclear how this can be achieved. And we also note that the recent agriculture bill consultation appeared to lack detail. If we assume also that new policies won't be in place until 2024 and new practices, particularly in this sector, will take time to implement, is it too late to achieve the target?
Well, I would be very unhappy to say that it's ever too late, but certainly it would have been easier had we started rather earlier. Let us put it in that way. Look, the problem is that we do have to face the fact that we can't meet net zero by 2050, leave alone the specialist targets of Scotland. We can't meet that unless we have a land use policy which actually deals with it. And you have to take the whole of the agricultural community into your confidence in this. And if you want to do that, there are 3 very specific necessities. First of all, you have to be clear what you want to do and the mechanisms you're going to use. People have to have confidence, because we all know, and I declare an interest as a small farmer, we all know that when we are making choices about what we plant and how we do it, we need to know what is the context in which we are making those choices. Now, I don't think that farming in Scotland knows that, because there is not enough clarity, and clarity is crucially important. The second thing is this business of partnership is absolutely important, because the government doesn't do the planting and doesn't do the husbandry. It's people do that, and they must feel that there is a proper relationship. And in the move from the Common Agricultural Policy to our new system, which I have to say is about the only advantage I can think of leaving the European Union, but I will not get onto that. The fact of the matter is we should be using it, but we're not using it, and we're not using it effectively enough, and it leaves people actually in the lurch. And the third thing that seems to me that is necessary is to be absolutely frank about what you're trying to do. What we need to do is to accept that agriculture has a huge part of our emissions, and that we've got to reduce that. And we've also got to accept that agriculture has a real opportunity to help reduce emissions because of sequestration. And we've got to find ways of helping agriculture to do both those things. And that does mean, again, 2 simple things: certainty and measurement. And the biggest issue here is measurement, because even if we had certainty, we wouldn't have a means of measuring how successful our certain policies were.
Thank you. And staying in the same area and about taking people and industry along on this journey, Professor Bell talked earlier of diet changes, which of course echoes the biodiversity conference at COP15. Protecting nature is about protecting food. Now, of course, the Climate Change Committee makes recommendations around diet change and I think encourages a move away from meat and poultry by 20% by 2030. The NFUS would counter that this could have a negative impact, not only on farmers and the economy, but crucially on food security, as well as increasing reliance on imports. So, Lord Deben, have you assessed the environmental cost of greater reliance on imported food over locally sourced food? And is there a danger that in the government trying to achieve its targets, it perhaps unwittingly sacrifices food security, livelihoods, and potentially, given import emissions, the environment?
Well, no, I don't think so, if it does the policy properly. And I do think, frankly, that the arguments are really not well founded. Let's just go through them. First of all, imports. Of course, you do not wish to replace home-produced product by imported product. If you're not going to do this, first of all, you mustn't have agreements with other countries which don't insist upon the same standards, which is why the Australian agreement and the New Zealand agreement are entirely unacceptable, because neither of them properly made sure that farmers were not going to have competition which was unfair because they were not meeting the same standards. So the Scottish government has every right to say that the British government that was a mistake and should not be continued. Secondly, what we're saying is that we should shift from, we should eat less meat, but we should eat better meat. Now, British meat has the lowest carbon footprint of any meat in the world. And therefore, what we're looking for is people to actually buy rather less, but better meat produced at home. And the reality is that we're all eating too much, leave alone meat. We all know that our actual diet means that we are an obese nation. We are the most obese nation in the whole of Europe, which is actually not very acceptable. Only the Americans and I think the Mexicans beat us. And this is not a range which we ought to be in. So we're talking about a very small change. The health people tell us that we should be eating very much less meat. It's not something I agree about. And I don't think anybody could blame me for being anything other than a carnivore. But it does seem to me that it is such a simple mechanism. And I do find that the attitude of farmers in some parts of the country really don't see this for what it is. It's a real chance for doing better. You don't have a lot of feedlots in Scotland. You have well-produced meat. You should be selling the well-produced meat from home production as the answer to this issue. And that is what we should be doing. And unless we get to the stage of recognizing that A, we're eating too much, B, we could change our diets without very much notice, and C, people are doing it already. And the reason why I'm particularly keen that farmers should be on board is that their danger is not that people will object to what we're talking about, but that people will increasingly say that a plant-based diet is the answer to our problems. That is not true. The truth is that we need farmers to have animals, and we need mixed farming, and we need to support that, but we just need to eat less and better.
Okay,
thank you, Commissioner.
I'm sorry, I'm feeling up against it slightly. Fiona, you've got a question, followed by Mark Ruskell.
Yes, I want to focus on peatland restoration. Your report talks about the learning we now have on historic emissions that needs adjustment for the current targets, but your report also indicates that global warming will also have an impact in the future on what might happen with peatland restoration, so peatland emissions. So in terms of what needs to be done on peatland, bearing in mind the Scottish Government is already investing £50 million a year as part of a £250 million package, which is substantial, what needs to be done to dial up the action on peatland restoration to make an impact?
Emily.
Emily, you're off.
But, okay, there we are. Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, so I think, well, yeah, so the issue is obviously that, well, there's a couple of issues. One is that we think that the targets are not ambitious enough, and the second is the targets are not being hit. Things are improving. So I think there was an increase in the last recorded year, and it's expected to go up again. But obviously it's far from the targets, and it is an important source of emission. And just to say that, you know, we've got this gap in 2030 of about 7 or 8 megatons between what we think our pathway and the target. And the lower peat ambition is 1 megaton. It means that that's in the Scottish plans means that there'll be extra 1 megaton of emissions from that. So we do think it's important to scale up both delivery and ambition. What needs to happen? I think barriers need to be addressed, right? So there's we've sort of highlighted that I think there's skills, contractor availability. I think there's some issues in financing and sort of people, you know, being sure of what options are available for them and clarity in the going forward. So I think it's this sort of barriers that need to be addressed. But the truth is, I don't think we're 100% sure why things are quite so far behind, basically, in terms of the Scottish Government's own targets. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
If anyone does, it will need to be briefly, I'm afraid. Who?
Well, let's move on then.
Okay. I'm sorry, Fiona.
Do you want me to go into my next area?
No, I'm quite keen. I think Mark Ruskell had a question on agriculture as well.
Well, it's just a very brief question, Convener, on the back of Liam Kerr's point about diet change. Just practically what you think government should be delivering on the back of that? I mean, is it about, you know, change in the way that public canteens and kitchens are offering choice? Is it about food labelling? What are the actual tools? Or is it all about market demand, given what you said, that people are generally moving towards eating less meat anyway?
Well, I think it's a mixture of all those things. I think government setting examples by the way in which they procure. Procurement is hugely important, and it would give the farmers much greater confidence if they felt that the procurement system really backed all this up. It's about public knowledge. When we took the Climate Change Committee around the country as a whole of the United Kingdom, I think the thing that really struck them most was the degree to which good-hearted people who wanted to do the right thing didn't know what it was they should be doing. And therefore, getting through all the extremists, because unfortunately there are extremists who want to use this as a means of promoting their own agenda, not the agenda of climate change, getting through that to a sensible, moderate way of saying to people, these are the sort of choices that you can make, a bit more help for teaching in schools about cooking and such like. All that is both boys and girls, is what we need to do. As usual, as one gets older, one discovers that it's usually not either or, but both and. And I think it's a question of doing all those things in a way which means that people begin to take it just naturally, that frankly, they do have meat once a day, but don't have it twice a day, or do have it 3 times a week. And when they do have it, they pay a bit extra for it because they know it's good, they know it's home produced, and they know it's better for them, and it's better for the climate too.
Okay, on that note, we're going to move to Monaco, who I think has got a question which she's going to direct specifically to one person, hopefully.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, Professor Bell perhaps would be best placed to pick it up. It's about the forthcoming circular economy bill. I know, again, your recommendations covered that. What would the committee expect to see in the Scottish Government's bill on circular economy?
Well, I think there are enormous challenges in trying to achieve it, because again, you're back to sort of a lot of individual choices by consumers, consumers at all scales, not just us as individuals, but businesses and different public organisations as consumers of stuff. So how to encourage different sorts of choices towards things that encourage reuse, that minimise waste. But it's got to be a range of things. Rather, as Lord Deben said in answer to the previous question, I think it's got to be both and in terms of all sorts of policies. And the public sector itself can take an important lead in this, I think. Yeah, otherwise, how you kind of encourage everything else to move back to information, back to awareness raising. But it's I think it's got to be the kind of whole mixture of policies. That's how it seems to me, anyway. I don't know whether any of my colleagues want to come in on this.
Sorry to interrupt. You mentioned the public sector, so I just wonder if there's any specific examples of what public sector could do in this space, because we've got a report from Circularity Scotland saying that Scotland's economy is only 1.3% circular at the moment. You talked about recycling more, but we need to consume less in the first place. So in terms of the public sector, what levers could be used? Is it procurement? Is it something else?
Well, yeah, I think procurement. I mean, but actually, I mean, it's not. It's reusing before recycling, as we know. You know, that's got to be an important first part of it. Repair of different sorts of appliances or products wherever that's possible. If you're making a procurement choice, it's leaning towards things that are repairable or that have a longer life, to the extent that you've got some idea about the embodied emissions in a product that's being, or a service that's being bought. Again, leaning towards that. Now, those kind of benefits in a kind of standard accounting framework might be discounted heavily because there's some way into the future, but the benefits will be there into the future. So we shouldn't be discounting overly heavily in terms of the financial analysis of any of these kinds of actions. So although it might be that certain products appear more expensive in terms of the initial upfront cost, they ought to be, even if they're still more expensive in the long run, not much more expensive and potentially cheaper in the long run. So again, it's all a kind of an encouragement towards these sorts of things that are kind of more efficient in our use of resources and have a reduced impact on what we're taking out of the planet.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Back to the Deputy Convener, Fiona Hislop.
The committee has taken a keen interest in carbon capture and storage, and we had a short focus inquiry earlier this year. Could you comment on the impact on the abatement figure of the potential of the Scottish cluster as part of future carbon capture and storage? We know that it wasn't part of Track 1, but there's still a strong emphasis in Scotland on the need for this, not only for our own abatement measures, but also the rest of the UK. And have you got any message for both governments, the UK and the Scottish Government, about the importance of carbon capture and storage to deliver on our climate change targets?
We need to have carbon capture and storage. We have particular advantages in the United Kingdom as a whole, which enables us to do it more effectively than some, because we can store it more effectively than some. Scotland obviously was a major competitor for one of the clusters. It does seem to us that the two governments have really got to come to terms with the fact that if Scotland is going to deliver what Scotland wants to deliver, then that does depend upon the significant role which removing carbon actually has. That is in your budget. That is actually one of the clear bits in your budget. So again, if we have a message to both governments, is carbon capture and storage is an essential part of doing what we need to do to reach net zero. And it is also clearly an important part of the Scottish Government's plans. And so it seems to me that the more that the Scottish Government defines the plans in other areas, the more it has a responsibility to remind the United Kingdom Government that it can't do this unless it has the help of the United Kingdom in enabling it to do the carbon capture and storage work that it needs to do. So there's a double thing here. I do think that the Scottish argument will be stronger if it is clearer about its means of reaching the things that it does have control over. But at the same time, it has a perfectly right policy to be able to say, if we're going to do this as a contribution to the United Kingdom, we do need to have the opportunity to do this, which we don't at the moment.
Just briefly, the timescale for this, for it to be effective in delivering on the targets, movement would have to be very soon indeed, I understand, from approval from the UK Government for acceleration for Track 2 from the current reserve list to make a big impact.
I think that is true, but in fact, I know it's to be true, but I think that Keith may well have an additional point on this. Keith?
No, well, I mean, I'm not privy to the information about exactly how UK government considerations are going on that Track 2 and where it is, but I mean, just my understanding is the same as yours, that it something does need to move soon in order that the development that's being proposed from Scotland can go ahead. I mean, that needs to be a strong proposal. The proposal needs to be sufficiently robust to encourage the investment of UK taxpayers' money. But if it is sufficiently robust, we want to see that kind of engagement from the UK government sooner rather than later. And actually, I think I see Emily has something to add here.
Yeah, sorry, just to add, because you asked specifically for abatement. So we have got an estimate of looking at current pipelines of projects of about 1 megaton being minus 1 megaton from greenhouse gas removals, looking at current projects by 2030, which is quite a lot less than what's in the climate change plan update, which is 3.8. So it's a lot less than that. And that's the sort of estimate that we have based on current projects. And of course, that also means that things have to move really fast even to get to that level.
Thank you. Convener.
Thank you, Fiona. And Mark Ruskell, coming back to you now.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of move beyond that, in terms of wider industrial decarbonisation that may or may not feed into ACORN, what you see as the sort of progress the Scottish Government can make working with industry between now and 2030. I mean, what are the options that are most deliverable within that timescale? I mean, for example, I commissioned and released a report yesterday into decarbonisation options for Mossmoran. I think that's the first time that a report's been done looking at a site-specific just transition and what that might mean for that plant. But what are your thoughts around wider industrial decarbonisation, and what are the big step changes that we can make?
Well, I'm first of all absolutely sure that the concept of localised work of the sort that you've just been talking of is absolutely crucial. Because again, in order to make that work, you've had to measure it, and you've had to say what could happen and what the result could be and how you could check that it actually is delivered. So I can see that that's an important part of what needs to be done. So certainly, one of the things the government can do is to concentrate on where actual action can take place and be measured. So certainly that's one of the major ways forward. But it looks to me as if, as far as I could see from that Emily had some comments, and then Keith.
Actually, I didn't on this one. Let's go straight to Keith on interest of time.
Okay, well, Keith, thank you.
Well, I think you're absolutely right to highlight the importance of particular sites. And we know in Scotland that industrial greenhouse gas emissions are dominated by a small number of large sites. This seems okay. I admit I'm not close to this as a subject area, but when I have had some discussions with Scottish Government officials, I don't know whether this is fair to say or not, I had the impression of a bit of defensiveness or nervousness about those few large sites, but that we have to engage with those questions to get some progress on this sector as a whole. The other point I think to make is that they're not the only sources of industrial emission. I mean, there's lots of production, manufacturing that is quite dispersed, distributed, and that in itself presents a large challenge, adds up to a significant amount, even if individual sites is not quite so much. So we shouldn't overlook the importance of emission reduction in other parts of manufacturing and industry as well.
Okay. Mark, is that okay? Thank you. And we've come to the end of all the questions. So I'm going to have a nice Christmas because I got all the committee members in. But I'd like to thank you all for taking part and sharing your expertise. Lord Deeban, I'd like to actually extend on behalf of the committee a special thanks for your input, not only in the past but also today. It was clear you have a huge depth of knowledge and beautifully choreographed your team to make sure that we were able to draw on their expertise. Now, I believe that I think I'm not breaking any confidences that you're standing down next year. So it might be that we don't get to see you in person, which I know you may feel contributes to net zero, but I think we will be would have liked to have seen you in person to benefit from the experience that you put in. And I'd like to give you a special thanks on behalf of this committee and our predecessor committee for all the input that you've given and the hard work you've put in on this subject. So a thank you to you and a thank you to your team for that. And let's hope there might be an opportunity to catch up with you next year before you do stand down.
Well, thank you very much. I've done my my legally allowable 10 years, and it's been extended until the end of June. So I have no doubt that we will find an opportunity, because I do not wish to leave the job without having another visit to Scotland, which I much appreciate. And again, I want to be able to have a year this year when I'm able again to, or at least my successor is able again to, congratulate Scotland and use you, as I want to use you, as a means of getting other people to do more than they are doing at the moment. So thank you very much for your kindness, and thank you too for the comments about the team. And I would like to thank them too, particularly for filling in without the presence of Chris Stark, which we hoped even this morning to have. But thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, and I hope you and your team have a very happy Christmas and that we will get to see you next year. We are going to move straight on to the next item on our agenda, which is agenda item 3, which is the consideration of a negative instrument, the Public Service Vehicles Registration of Local Services Scotland. No, I've got that wrong. There's so many brackets here. So it's the Public Service Vehicles Registration of Local Services, Provision of Service Information, Scotland Regulations 2022. The instrument is laid under the negative procedure, which means that its provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul them. No motions to annul have been laid, and I wondered if there were any comments from any of the members. No. Therefore, there are no comments, so I think we are agreed on that, and that concludes our public meeting. Hold on. Sorry. Okay, so I just have to read this out. Technically, to invite the committee to agree that it does not wish to make any further recommendations in relation to the instrument. Are we agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. That concludes our public meeting, and we're now going to move into private session. Thank you.